Hey folks, Nathan here. This is my YouTube channel, and this is a new episode with a new arc, so to speak, here for Nate's favorite deck building games. We've already taken a look at Star Realms and Ascension, and I promised a long time ago that we'd take a look at the DC deck building game. We're finally going to do that to mark the release of the big DC deck building game Multiverse box, which includes new cards, dividers, and all the space you need to basically put in pretty much every product released thus far for the DC deck building game. So what we're going to do is discuss all those different releases, and as I go along, I will finally be able to pull the cards from those and stick them in this box and get rid of the original boxes that take up way too much space. So we'll start here, of course, with the initial set, just known as the DC deck building game. Now, for most players, this was your starting point. The DC deck building game, this is the original starter set here, and you can see it very much focuses on the Justice League heroes, right? So Green Lantern, Cyborg, Batman, Superman, Wonder Woman, Aquaman, and the Flash, which turn out to be the 7 heroes you can play as in this deck building game. Now you notice here, as I talk you through what's in this set and how it differs from things like Star Realms or Ascension, I do have a playmat here designed by the look of that first deck building game set. Keep in mind though, these are not included. This is one of those deck building games that does not have an included layout at all. No playmats, no game boards, not even little instructions that fold out and become a play area. You just play it on a regular table unless you want to spring for buying a playmat. And most of the early playmats are currently out of stock most places because they are out of print. This one in particular is a little tough to find, but they're out there if you want to spend the money and get lucky on something like eBay. Of course, this being a set that's a standalone game, or can be, we have our instruction manual here, rather large, gives all the information on your turn sequence and end of turn on the back in case you need it. The one thing that tends to differentiate this game from most deck building games is that you actually have a hero that represents you. You aren't just this faceless entity on your side versus the faceless entity on the other side, either cooperatively or competitively. Instead, you actually have a character representing you from among these 7 DC superheroes. They're represented by these oversized superhero cards. They all have the Cryptozoic background on them, so they can be mixed in with any Cryptozoic set, even if it's not DC. You'll find all the backs, even on the regular cards, looking the same, at least until we get to the point where they decide to make the top supervillain of the game blue on the back so you know which one should be the last one you face. But we'll get to that momentarily, and it's not something really that fits in with this first set. But these large cards tell you which hero you are, Green Lantern, Batman, Aquaman, whoever, but you also have a special ability tied into that hero. So for instance, for Green Lantern at the bottom it says, if you play 3 or more cards with different names and cost 1 or more during your turn, plus 3 power. And the ability is different for each hero. So you can sort of tailor your play type depending on whether you decide with the other people playing to choose your characters to start with, or if you draw randomly. It'll give you a little bit of variance in your strategy if you play this game multiple times, because you could play with multiple heroes that have those different abilities. You have a relatively straightforward layout here, very similar again to Star Realms or to Ascension. You're going to have a main deck, which is where your cards are going to tend to be drawn from off here to the side. You're going to have 5 rather than 6 cards here in what was called the trade row in Star Realms, or the center row in Ascension is called the lineup in the DC deck building game. So let's go ahead and lay some of those out. There we go. That's a nice starting point for us. The cards that are included inside the main deck and inside the lineup that you can acquire include heroes. A hero is going to give you some beneficial effect, like in this case, draw a card. Locations that act like ongoing cards. You put it in play and it stays in front of you for the rest of the game unless something removes it, which has some type of ongoing effect. You have equipment there in gray that usually has some kind of beneficial effect, but something a little more geared towards controlling the situation than you would see with a hero. Villains, which wind up being acquired and being able to be played as well. And then you have superpowers that are special abilities you can do again once you acquire them. Now you'll notice here though, as you go across, that the number on each is the same background, just that gray circle. This is not a game that uses multiple different types of currencies most of the time. So whereas with Star Realms, you had your trade amounts and you had your attack amounts, and you got your power and your runes and so forth, and all kinds of other crazy things with expansions for Ascension. Whereas with a DC deck building game, it's all about simply power. 2 power to acquire, 5 power to acquire, 3, 5, 3, and so on. Now there are a couple of interesting things that could happen with these cards though. For example, some villains might have the attack ability on here. And attack, essentially, is this idea that when you play that card, not only are you having an effect on the main play space here, you're also doing something to go after the other players. So for instance, in this case, his attack says each foe gains a weakness. So there's these things called weakness cards we're going to look at in a second, and if you play this card, everybody else gets hit by that attack and has to get one of those weakness cards, unless they have a card like this one they can play, usually on a turn that's not their own, that says defense. Defense essentially gives you an ability that not only blocks an attack that's coming at you, but usually gives you something else. For instance, in the case of super speed there, it says defense. You may discard this card to avoid an attack. If you do, draw 2 cards. So not only do you avoid the attack, you draw 2 cards, which is nice because that means you're using that card, you won't be able to use it on your turn, so at least you're getting some benefit out of it. Now we do have another of those symbols down in the bottom left corner that's going to determine who wins or not, very much like Ascension with honor points. In this case, they're called victory points. Each card you acquire has a different amount of victory points in the corner, in this case 1. The winner is the person who winds up with the most victory points. Another interesting thing about the center row, or in this case the lineup as they call it, unlike what we see in something like a Star Realms or something like an Ascension, the lineup does not immediately refill. So if I were to, for instance, acquire Nth Metal here, nothing goes in that spot until my turn is over. So in theory, someone who has a ton of power can't just go through and acquire an entire row and just keep going acquiring things. Once everything in the lineup is gone, it's just gone. Now we're talking about power, right? The one main resource in this game that you're using to acquire cards. Where is that coming from? Well, initially, it's coming from your starter deck. Now the game itself comes with 114 main deck cards, and then comes with 36 starting cards called Punch, and 16 called Vulnerability. Your Punch is a starting card you get 7 of in your initial hand. So we are going back to having a hand, by the way, initially of 10, just like in Ascension, but instead of 8 of one thing and 2 of another, it's 7 of one thing and 3 of another. This gives you 1 power each time you play it. Note it says starter, so you know it doesn't go in here. Just like having that special border in Ascension lets you know not to stick it into the deck. So we have 7 punch cards, and then you also have what's referred to as vulnerability cards. You get 3 of these. Now the interesting thing here is that a vulnerability card is not about really hurting you, so much as a matter of making your hand a little weaker than it might otherwise have been. So whereas something like, say, an Ascension or a Star Realms is going to give you 2 different types of starting card that each have a different amount of some kind of currency you're getting or some resource you're getting to do something with. In this case, 7 out of the 10 are giving you a resource. The other 3 are giving you nothing. It's worth nothing, costs nothing, and does nothing. It's simply taking space in your hand as something you can't really do anything with. These are one of these cards that are going to be something that you want to discard or get rid of out of the game if you have the ability to do so at some point throughout the gameplay. Usually when a card effect allows you to do so. But you'll have your starting hand there, and then as you play, as you build up your power, you're acquiring by spending that power. Now, there are also always available cards in this game, just like we saw back with the other 2. In this case, we have Kick. The game includes 16 kick cards to start with. A kick costs 3 power to acquire, is only worth 1 victory point, but at least it's worth something, and gives you 2 power when you play it on that turn. They're always available, at least until they run out, over there. So on any turn of yours, you could acquire that. If you decide not to acquire something in the lineup, Whereas you also have another always available card that you actually don't want to get on purpose, but which some cards will cause you to have to take, such as the attack there for Scarecrow, and that is called Weakness. It's a little bit different than what we saw with the other games. Weakness is designed to hurt you. So a Weakness card costs nothing because you don't want to acquire it. But notice there the victory cost, or the victory points, are -1. It takes away 1 point of victory points for every one of these sitting in your deck. And it is going through your deck in your hand like anything else, so just like a vulnerability, it's not going to do anything. It just says weakness cards reduce your score at the end of the game. So it's yet another card that could take a place in your hand instead of a card that can actually do something for you. Okay? You start out with 20 of these, and they get set off to the side as the weaknesses. Now, one thing that makes this game particularly different from many other deck building games is that not only are you having a character representing you, there are characters that represent sort of the big bads of the game that need to be taken out. That's the supervillains. Cards like Ra's al Ghul here, or Captain Cold. The idea is that you've got 12 of these to start with. You'll randomly choose 7 out of anyone except for Ra's al Ghul, who has to be the first one according to the rules in this case. So you'll randomly choose 7, put them face down, and then put Ra's al Ghul face up on it, which makes Ra's al Ghul the active supervillain. He has a power cost. So to defeat this supervillain, we have to build up 8 power on our turn and spend it. So rather than, say, spending 5 here and 3 here, or 5 here and 3 here, or 5 here and 3 here, if we built up 8, we can knock out Ra's al Ghul. The reason we'd want to do that is, 1, it gets us closer to the end of the game, but when you take out a supervillain, their victory points tend to be higher, in this case 4, and they go into your deck so you can use some special ability that usually is pretty cool. In Ra's al Ghul's case, he gives you 3 power when you play him, and at the end of your turn, you put it on the bottom of your deck before you draw a new hand, instead of letting it sit in the discard pile. So it allows you to sort of cycle him through faster than you otherwise would be able. So let's say I defeat Ra's al Ghul on my turn. Nice powerful card just entered my deck. At the end of the turn, one of the steps, aside from refilling the lineup of any cards that are missing, is to flip the supervillain over if it isn't already face up. Generally, if there's a new one that's coming up. Now we get the anti-monitor. But every one of them except the one that's required to be first also has an effect here called First Appearance Attack. So as soon as I flip this one over, it's his first appearance, there's an attack that goes after usually everybody. In this case, each player reveals his hand, choose a card with cost of 1 or greater from it, and adds that card to the lineup. So something that was in your hand that you could have used now goes out there for anybody to acquire. Okay? And again, the only way to avoid an attack is with a defense card. As for the turn sequence, the end of turn, and how the game ends, fairly straightforward. I actually find that this is a bit of an easier game to learn for somebody who's maybe just starting to dab their toes into something like an Ascension or a Star Realms, mainly because there's just that one currency to manage. During your turn, you play cards from your hand, which is generally 5 cards, by the way. You total up your power and purchase any cards with combined costs of less or equal to that total, as I mentioned already. And then as soon as you buy or gain a card, you place it in your discard pile, unless you're instructed otherwise. At the end of your turn, once you're done doing that as much as you can, you place all the cards you played and any remaining cards from your hand, as is the case in most deck building games, into your discard pile and draw a new hand of 5 cards. That way, if there's a card you didn't play and it's still sitting in your hand because you didn't find it useful, you're not just stuck with it, it recycles along with everything else into your discard pile. Then, you're going to fill each empty slot in the lineup with a card from the top of the main deck. So if you've acquired anything here and it's empty, that's when you refill it. At the end of your turn, not during the turn immediately, which is the case in most of these types of games. Then if the top card of the supervillain stack is face down, you flip it face up, and you read aloud and activate that first appearance attack that I mentioned. You don't wind up shuffling your discard pile just because you have no cards in your deck. You must wait until you actually have to draw a discard or reveal a card from your deck and then shuffle it again, as with most deck building games. It's that need to draw and not having something to draw that triggers the discard pile being shuffled into a new deck. It's a subtle difference, but it does make a difference in some gameplay scenarios. As for when the game ends, it's when one of 2 things happens. Either you get to the end of a turn and it's time to flip up a new supervillain, but the last one has just been defeated. So there isn't one you can flip up from that stack. When that happens, the game is over. Or, if you actually work your way through this entire stack, and you get to a point where you're supposed to refill the lineup, but you don't have enough cards in the main deck here sitting there to do it, then the game ends. Both of which are conditions that are met after the end of the current turn, because those are both things that happen during that end of turn phase. And I'll tell you, the way that the early games are set up, there isn't a set order you're supposed to go through to defeat the supervillains. They're in a random order. So you might wind up early in the game having someone like Anti-Monitor sitting there right after Ra's al Ghul, as we just had, with a power of 12. And it may take quite a while as you burn through the main deck in order for anybody to get enough power of 12 on one turn to knock that guy out. So later games will wind up changing it around so that the higher power ones tend to be the last ones or some of the last ones that you face, so that you don't wind up in a situation where the entire early game is basically avoiding the supervillain stack because you just can't do anything with him yet. When that happens, you're sort of stuck in place, and this game can tend to drag on. It can be super fast if you're lucky about the order of the supervillains, or if you're unlucky with the order of the supervillains, it can take a long time. And I actually have had games end because the main deck ran out instead of the 8 supervillains being defeated. So it was a bit of a hinky thing, at least in the early versions of the DC deck building game. But I like this one. It's fun, it's fast-paced, it's got some interesting mechanics with the supervillains, the fact that you are being represented by a superhero that has some kind of special ability, though sometimes those do feel a little bit imbalanced. And the fact that it's just kind of a fast-paced DC-themed thing. You really sort of get a feel for the universe as you're playing, the idea that you really are fighting evil, and that you are essentially, despite being a superhero, somewhat flawed because you will run into those weaknesses and vulnerabilities that slow you down, but don't necessarily hurt. And it's also nice to be able to have, to some degree, the ability to go after the other players more directly with that attack and defense mechanic, without this necessarily being a fully competitive game. It's still the idea that you're both heroes and you're out there trying to save the world from these villains, and the person who wins has the most victory points, which just means that you defeated more villains or you saved the day more than the other guy. So it's sort of cooperative in concept, but competitive in what you actually do. It's not like you're trying to kill each other the way that you are in Star Realms. So takes away some of that, yeah, in your face kind of stuff that can make some gameplay sessions a little bit more frustrating. Definitely one to check out if you're into DC Comics. Fortunately, though, there are 4 main sets right now. There is a 5th coming soon. So if maybe right now those Justice League characters really aren't your thing, you want to play with somebody maybe other than Batman, Superman, Wonder Woman, Aquaman, Flash, Cyborg, or Green Lantern, you're in luck, because next we'll be taking a look at the 2nd set, which was released, called Heroes Unite. We'll see that one in our next video.